By way of introduction, I just want to say I'm saving the introduction of who I am and why the heck I'm doing this podcast and what I'm about and what I practice and what I used to believe and what I now believe and what I don't believe and all of that good stuff for the end. Because I didn't want to bore you with that. I just thought we'd get into talking about what really interests me most, which is direct spiritual experience. I grew up in a conservative Christian cult. I call it a cult, and I will get into the reasons why I call it a cult later. Not the Kool-Aid drinking kind of cult that most people imagine when they hear the word cult, but in a modern context, the word cult is being opened up to any organization that essentially tries to control your life completely. I'll get into details about why I consider the religion in which I was raised a cult and why it's not just some offshoot of Christianity. But the most direct spiritual experience one could hope for in what was essentially just a sect of Christianity, you would see it as pretty normal if you just walked into one of the church services, was getting emotional about stuff. So maybe every once in a while there would be a really great speaker who would give up and give a sermon and talk about Jesus and God and all that wonderful stuff. And because they were good, polished, poised speakers, you could have an emotional experience about that while talking about and thinking about Jesus and God and forms of spirituality. If you do that, then yeah, you're going to have a sort of direct spiritual experience in the sense that you're getting hyped up for God or whatever. But that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about direct spiritual experience. And I see that in a modern context, that's really the only thing that people know about religious experience, about spiritual experience. The common person has never had an experience of divine bliss. A common person has never had an experience of ecstatic union with God. You can come up with any term that you want to describe it. The words never work. And all the great sages and all the great traditions will tell you this over and over again. That which can be spoken about the eternal Tao is not the eternal Tao. I may have an experience and I am unable to put it into words. That is an ineffable experience. That's what I'm talking about. But not just an experience that's impossible to define in words because it was a subjective experience. I'm talking about transcendent experience. Experiences that go beyond your normal, everyday, get up in the morning, go to Starbucks, go to work, come back and watch Netflix. The only different types of experience that we have or states of consciousness that we're used to experiencing in a modern context are being sleepy, meaning I don't have a lot of energy, so my mind is not working, being hyped up on caffeine and sugar, so flying a million miles a minute, and apparently that's how we're supposed to get work done in this country and other places. And maybe being on some kind of substance or whatever. But basically the only types of consciousness that we're used to talking about in our world are like, I'm either awake or I'm asleep. So you're either conscious or you're not. There's nothing in our society that allows for a discussion of different types of consciousness experience, different types of experiences of consciousness, or different states of awareness that really go beyond these mundane levels. When we're talking about spiritual experience, we have to talk about states of consciousness that transcend, that go beyond this, what we're just doing, talking to each other on a daily basis, project an air of, yeah, everything's fine. And that's what we consider our base reality. Everybody kind of like maintains a certain level of awareness and unawareness. We pretend not to be aware of things that we see, like smelling alcohol on your colleague's breath and just brushing it off and going about your day. Some types of experiences that might be transcendent for us are things like going to music festivals and taking a bunch of drugs, or just taking a bunch of drugs in general. If anybody's experimented psychedelics and they know different states of consciousness. And again, these are the only ways that they're familiar with getting them. Either you haven't eaten and your blood sugar is low and your brain is not working, or you haven't had your coffee and your brain is not working, or you've been eating like really amazing and working out all the time and you're taking a bunch of supplements and things. And that makes you feel super, super good, and your mind is just sharp as a tack, and you might be able to classify that or characterize that as a sort of transcendent experience, or a transcendent state of consciousness or awareness, because it seems to go beyond what you're used to dealing with. In that instance, you're pushing yourself beyond your physical limits in a way. But for the most part, that's it. Most of us don't know anything about other states of consciousness, other states of awareness, and we think that that is relegated to people who experiment with drugs, and they're probably all degenerates and going to die soon anyway. Most people will have experiences with something like cannabis or alcohol, and yeah, that's a different state of consciousness. But the point is that we only have experiences with other states of consciousness, at least we think we do, from our dream states and from substances. Food being one of the most obvious substances, and I already talked about that. Either you don't eat, you feel like crap, you do eat, you feel good, or you eat crap, you feel like crap anyway, whatever. But it's very connected to substances. And most people, if they do have some experiences that they can classify as transcendent or spiritual experiences, or an awakening of some kind, a direct spiritual experience, it usually involves some kind of drug. I think it's also important to note that in today's society, pharmaceutical drugs are probably the biggest culprit of this, even though a lot of people don't like to admit it. I can always tell when a friend calls and they've taken a little too much Xanax or something. I can always tell when somebody is on certain types of pharmaceutical medications, because their personalities will change, their responses will change, even the look in their eyes is different. I can always tell when people are on harder drugs too. It's just this kind of like spidey sense that I have. I don't really know where it comes from. I remember this one time I had a boyfriend when I was back in California, and he smoked mad weed like all day long, and that was supposed to be his medication. But then towards the end of the evening, he would also pop an Ambien so that he could, quote unquote, get good sleep. And one time he tried to stay awake after he had popped an Ambien and started talking about the craziest shit. It was just zany, like cuckoo bananas. It made no sense. And I was like, what is this drug? And you can go to the doctor and say, I have insomnia, and they will give you this drug, which to me is 1,000 times scarier than cannabis, you know? And for whatever reason, because our society works the way it does, an Ambien is okay because a doctor prescribed it, but weed is not, because lazy Mexicans and stoners. You know, it's just stupid cultural nonsense, and I wish it would go away. But again, for the most part, that's the only experience that anybody in our culture has with transcendent states of consciousness. And I would argue that our institutions, and our traditional institutions, our religious institutions, our spiritual centers, etc., do not offer people a route to direct spiritual experience. I think that's what's missing in all of these traditions, a lot of these traditions, is there's no changing of consciousness. I'm an old chaos magician myself, and so it was always gnosis, gnosis, gnosis. There always had to be some kind of altered state of consciousness, not necessarily with a substance. They can be naturally induced too. One way is through, rhythmic breathing, real deep breathing, that kind of thing. But you could also just think of it as yogic breathing, yogic breaths, different types of Taoist breath circulations and whatnot. You can spin around for a long time until you get dizzy. Obviously, make sure that you're doing it in a safe place and that you have a place to lie down afterwards. And as you do that, you're doing a ritual, perhaps creating a sigil or symbol or a piece of art or something that is connected to the intention that is your magical desire. And then you enter into an altered state of consciousness in order to help etch that desire, that intention into the ether, or to fire it out into the universe, as it were, to manifest to you. And I suppose ever since working in that fashion, I've never felt comfortable just doing a ritual. And I'm trying to paint a picture here. My own personal experience is very personal. And after I got out of the Christian church, I studied yoga. I studied all these, higher spiritual traditions. And eventually I did get around to practicing chaos magic in a very modern sense. Chaos magic, if you don't know, is a sort of bare bones, strip down all of the traditions. The traditions don't really make any sense. They just have these sort of correspondences and associations that to a modern eye, to a modern person, they don't really matter. Okay, I'm supposed to do this on the equinox because why? I'm supposed to use this plant and this oil and that, because why? Like, they're just plants, they're just oils. What really matters is the intention, is the wizard, is the magician and his will. And I never felt comfortable after exploring that and after practicing chaos magic type stuff for a long time. I never felt comfortable doing any type of ritual without a transcendent experience, without some type of altered state of consciousness. And I would even argue that the transcendent experiences are a form of spirituality in themselves, that we don't necessarily have to attach them to anything if we are experiencing something transcendent and not just spinning around and getting dizzy and falling on the floor or whatever, but experimenting with certain techniques like that in order to propel your consciousness somewhere else to experience a different form of consciousness. I would argue that that is more in line with real spirituality, real spiritual practice, and real spiritual experience than doing an empty ritual just because lavender is associated with mental clarity and peace, involving lavender. I did say I wasn't going to go too much into my own, introduction and who I am and where I come from and all of that, but it's sort of part and parcel with the conversation. I grew up in what could be considered a standard Christian sect. And we, a little bit different, we went to church 3 times a week. Most people just go on Sundays and they have Easter services and things or whatever. That was all completely foreign to me. We went 3 times a week. And once in somebody's little house, where you would meet in somebody's little house and do a Bible study that way. So in a lot of ways, my early quote unquote spiritual experience was very almost academic. It was very focused on studying scripture and reading the commentaries and expositories on that by the organization to which I belonged. So there wasn't anything beyond fellowship and feeling good that you were gathering with other people who were God's only chosen people. We did believe that. We believed that every other form of Christianity was essentially evil. And so when you gather together with people who not only you have a religious belief system in common with, but who also believe that they're the only people on earth who are going to be saved in Armageddon, it can make for some very emotional times. That's why I mentioned the emotionality of religious or spiritual experience, because I think we equate having religious or spiritual feelings about certain dogmas or beliefs with spiritual experience. And I don't think that should be the case. I am not decrying anybody's belief systems. I want to talk about all forms of spirituality on this podcast, and I embrace all forms of spirituality. Which is to say, I believe You can believe whatever you want to believe, and you can practice whatever you want to practice. And I myself am very eclectic in the spiritual practices that I've picked up over the years. But I've always been of the mentality, if you're not experiencing something real, do something else. Even if it's just a meditation practice or energy work or prayer, if you have a prayer practice, whatever it is, doing affirmations. If it ain't working, do something else. And for me, a sign that it's not working is you're not actually having an experience. It's relatively easy to get excited about something. Just sit with the salesman for 15 minutes or whatever. They will hype you up even though you don't want to be hyped up about that electronic juicer or whatever it is. It's easy to get hyped up about stuff. It's easy to engage in emotionality, especially, again, when you're in fellowship with a bunch of people who believe exactly what you believe and everybody's doing the same thing and you're singing songs together. That's easy. That's the base level of human experience. We get emotional about stuff. That's not spirituality. It can be applied to spirituality. One of my favorite phrases is to inflame yourself in prayer. I think that a lot of people whose basically only personal spiritual practice besides, taking communion or going to confession or just going to church with grandma on Sundays is prayer. A lot of people still engage in prayer, obviously, and I think it can be a wonderful, beautiful practice. But I don't think people do it right. You should inflame yourself in prayer, which means you should actively engage your emotions while praying. I used to pray at night and I'd fall asleep halfway through the prayer. Then I'd wake up and be like, oh God, please forgive me. I forgot to say amen. That's not spiritual experience. That's not a spiritual practice. I was trying, don't get me wrong. I was a very devout little kid. I was very good. I did everything my parents wanted me to do. And I believed in God and all that good stuff. And I prayed all the time. I was a fat little gay boy, who was interested in magic and all this stuff and didn't know what was happening to him or his body. I prayed all the time, and I would get very emotional about it. But at the same time, it wasn't really a spiritual practice, not by my definitions. So these emotional states, they can be used in order to connect you to something beyond yourself. If you are praying to a specific God, praying to Jesus or whatever, those practices and inflaming yourself in prayer can take your prayer practice, your spiritual practice, and amp it up 30,000 times. You will connect to Jesus if you do that in a real emotional, spiritual way. In a way that goes far beyond the trivial emotionality of getting together with a bunch of people who believe exactly the same things that you do. That was my general experience growing up, and it was very pleasant. But spirituality is not supposed to just be pleasant all the time. It's supposed to rock your world. It's supposed to knock your socks off. And that's really why I want to bring up this notion of experiential spirituality or direct spiritual experience. What does that even mean? What do we normally experience when we engage in sort of secular spiritual practices, whatever they may be? Going to a music festival and doing drugs with friends, or sitting in the pews, or going to temple and praying and saying the things. There is a lot of good that comes from religious and spiritual institutions and organizations, I believe, which is it provides a structure and it provides somewhat of an experience. But it is just a framework, it is just a modality in which to work for you to find something truly transcendent. And finding something transcendent is always up to you. It's not up to God through an act of grace. That might happen, if you really, really, really believe that for a very long time, it's just going to happen one day. It probably will. At least something will. But you can do it yourself. And I think that's also something that's missing from the modern context of spirituality, which is it is up to me to get to know God. It is up to me to figure out how to communicate with the divine, if that's the way that you want to put it. It is up to me to figure out how to engage in real, direct spiritual experience. It is up to me to choose a type of spirituality that allows me to experience spirit. It seems very, very obvious when you say it like that, but if you're not experiencing spirit, what are you even doing? The first time I ever really had what I would consider to be a true, direct spiritual experience. As I said before, this was around the time that I was actively dabbling in chaos magic, and it was never mundane stuff for me. I was never like, ooh, let me find $20 on the floor tomorrow and, all this stuff, or please make Kevin have a crush on me, or whatever. It was never paltry stuff like that. I was always, even though it seems like to be a bare bones type of magical practice and stripping away the traditions and the correspondences and the associations and just getting to what works, even though it is that, for me, I always applied it to higher spirituality. So I would do spells and rituals and come up with mantras and things to blast open my crown chakra so that I could experience the divine, or open my third eye, or, I would do different spells and magical rituals and things to try to get to know my daemon, or my higher self, my Atman consciousness, merging all of those things together in one umbrella term, just higher self, I guess. But yeah, it was always with a higher spiritual focus. I had also begun to practice Reiki. A friend of mine was a Reiki master. I don't even like using that word, especially in reference to Reiki, especially these days. That'll be a new episode. But he was very good, and he's a very powerful healer and a very good energy worker and has a lovely personality and all of that. And he offered to give me a free initiation into Reiki level 1. And with him, it was very sincere. It was very spiritually based, that this was like a blessing and a certain initiation into a certain line that was going to lead you down a certain path. And it was always with that emphasis on high spirituality, which I dug, right? But unfortunately, as the months rolled on by, I never felt a damn thing from Reiki. I didn't feel heat. I didn't feel energy. I didn't feel healed. It was like, okay, where's the pretty lights, or where's the spiritual experience? Where's anything? Where's my Reiki, dude? Until one day, I was just walking around my house, Reikiing everything. So I had decorations set up, and I was putting my hands over them, and I was just kind of being like, it's like taking my sweet time, and, energy work over here, energy work in the corner, clean out the ick things in the corners. I didn't know really what I was doing, but I was doing it. I was just going to be like, I'm a special sage now, and, flitting about and spreading spiritual energy on stuff. And then I got to my bedroom dresser, and I'm Reikiing this and I'm Reikiing that. And then I put my hands over this donut-shaped double ocarina that I had. It was made out of clay. It was earthenware, and it was it had a beautiful blue glaze on it. It was double-sided, so you could play two notes at once, make little chords, And I had it since I was 17 years old, and it was precious to me. Like, it really was this thing that I coveted for so long, because that was a gazillion years ago when the Ocarina of Time, Zelda, came out, and I had bought the game, and it was like, oh my god, look at these graphics, man, whoa. Sprites are terrible, but we thought it was like back then. And I was really into the game. One time, it was like, my mom walks by and sees Link, and he's got the like blonde hair, and it's kind of like waving over his face, and she's like, oh, look, it's a little you. And I was like, yes, I am an elf. And ever since then, I just like kind of wanted an ocarina. So I finally found one online, and it was handmade and it was beautiful. It just had this spirit about it. And I used to play. And as I was doing Reiki over this weird double ocarina that I had had since I was 17, at the time I must have been like 24, 25 years old, suddenly my head was raised up. I had no control over it. My head was raised up as if staring towards the sky. And this incredibly bright strand of light just from heaven, it's the only way I can describe it, came down, just this beam, this intense beam of blue-white light, crystalline blue-white light, and just shone into my third eye. That's where it went because I felt it, and just held me completely still. And I felt this presence behind me as if like angel wings, just kind of like cradling around me, bigger than I could imagine, bigger than my brain could handle, certainly bigger than my, mundane mind knew how to interpret back then. And it was just there. And this cone of light was just beaming into my forehead. And I couldn't move. I was completely transfixed. That was my first spiritual experience. And after it disengaged, I fell back onto the bed, which was directly behind me, and just lie there panting for like 5 minutes because I had no idea what the fuck just happened. That's a spiritual experience. That's a direct spiritual experience. That is a direct experience of the divine of some sort, or at least it is a transcendent experience, right? I have experienced so many trance states, so many transcendent states since then that probably absolutely blow it out of the water. And yet, because that was my first real direct spiritual experience, it's still the one I always go back to. It was formative. It didn't speak to me. It didn't say anything. There was no message. There was no overarching feeling of love. But it was a presence that was not me. And it felt like my holy guardian angel. Like it felt like something so far beyond me, but that was also me at the same time that I had absolutely no words to describe it. And it was almost just like, my spirit, my higher spirit, my soul, whatever you want to call it, just decided to shine a light on me just to let me know, hey, knock, 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 this stuff is real. Just so you know, this stuff is real. All that stuff that I had been reading about, Paramahansa Yogananda and in Autobiography of a Yogi, and having all of these experiences of Diksha and transcendent states of awareness and whatnot, I was still like, okay, yeah, maybe they're just making it up. Maybe it's just all in their heads, But that experience proved otherwise. The problem with all this kind of stuff, of course, and even talking about direct spiritual experience in general, is that it's all subjective. And if anything is subjective or considered to be subjective in this world, it's automatically considered not real. That is a damn sham. In our society, in modern culture, in people's everyday way of thinking, they think that just because something is in their head, it is not real. Just because it was a subjective experience and cannot be objectively described or explained through scientific, reductive, materialistic means, it is not real. That is probably the worst thing that you can say about modern society, is people don't even believe that their own experience is real. I don't even know what to say about that. I feel like dropping the mic, What could be more important than your own subjective experience? Fuck all the materialistic, reductionistic, scientific bullshit. Believe me, I love science, especially medical science. It saved my life, and we'll have a whole episode devoted to that. I promise. But at the same time, that's a stupid way of looking at the world. It does not tell you anything about the why or the actual experience. I remember this old joke. It was like, I doubt I'll be able to do it justice, but it was like a poet and a physicist were flying in a plane together, and they both look out the side of the window, and they see sheep grazing in a field. And the poet such gentle sheep, fluffy white clouds of blah, blah, blah. And it's describing the experience of seeing these beautiful sheep and this pasture or whatever. And the physicist looks down and says, over North America, there exists a sheep, white on top. And it's just like as reductionistic and pinpoint exactly the location, what it is and sort of what it looks like, having nothing to do with the actual subjective experience of flying over a pasture and seeing all of these sheep, and it was very beautiful and I was moved. That's the problem with all of modern society today, especially to me when it comes to spirituality, because we think it's all crap. What we don't think is crap are the religious institutions, because they are attached to tradition, because our parents went, because our grandparents went, because that's what you do as a patriotic American. This is what you do to keep society going. Nobody's trying to have transcendent spiritual experiences at your local Episcopalian church. Some of them might be, I know a few, but that's just not what's going to happen. That's not what people are seeking. They're seeking sense of peace within themselves, knowing that they are still adhering to traditions that they hold dear or believe are special or sacred because their parents and grandparents believed they were special and sacred. That has very little in my mind to do with actually getting to know God, with actual direct spiritual experience, or taking charge of your own spiritual life, your own spiritual experience, your own spiritual practice, and realizing wholeheartedly that if I want to get anywhere, if I want to experience anything, if I want to prove any of this stuff to myself, I have to figure it out myself. One other thing I wanted to mention is just because you're experiencing something doesn't necessarily mean it is spirit, and just because you're experiencing something doesn't necessarily mean it is good. I recall somebody who was a friend of mine, and he was gay, and he didn't really grow up with anything spiritual, no beliefs or whatever to speak of. And some friends of his, I think, were Pentecostal, and they were doing some kind of group and, sort of faith healing experience or whatever. And he decided to go just to check it out, just to see what it was like or whatever. And they were like pushing him, of course, to accept Jesus, accept Jesus, accept Jesus. It's not going to work if you don't accept Jesus or whatever. And he was like, I can't do that. But as they were like, over him and like the laying on of hands, and they're getting ecstatic and shouting and maybe speaking in tongues and stuff like that, well, he was kind of weirded out by it. At the same time, he could feel a spiral of energy moving around his brow, around his third eye, as if something was trying to push into it. This is another type of experience. I would call it energetic. It could have led to a spiritual experience if he was more open to accepting it. But also, just because people are able to make you experience something doesn't necessarily mean it's the best thing in the world. He wouldn't have jibed with their Pentecostal beliefs for sure. And I don't think he would ever be able to accept Jesus Christ as his personal Lord and Savior. That kind of concept didn't even figure into his thinking, much like let's pick it apart. Why I'm going to do that, why I'm not going to do that. Here we go. But these people, regardless of where this energy was coming from, where this experience that they were able to confer upon others in the room was coming from, were able to do something and make people feel something, make people experience something. I don't necessarily think that that means it's a good thing. Just because they say in the name of Jesus or whatever, I really feel that that kind of thing, that charismatic stuff, comes from a place of like group energy. I don't want to say hypnotism because it's not really exactly what's going on here, but everybody's getting hyped up. Everybody's getting worked up. There is a lot of energy in the room, kinetic energy in the room. And as they're able to direct that into someone, they might have an experience. They might even have an emotional release of some kind or whatever. But again, I don't think that it's necessarily in the best context. So I really feel that you have to be wary about that kind of stuff. The other thing is I've noticed that people are opening up to channeling today like nobody's business. I'll have to do an entire episode on this as well, because I think that it's dangerous. I really do. Not just in the sense that, ooh, you don't know what you're talking to. If you have your meditation skills down, then you're only going to channel or come in contact with that which you intend to work with. I believe that wholeheartedly. However, people put it into this context of just opening themselves up. It's like they're doing an old-fashioned spiritualism seance or something. Oh, spirits, wherever you may be. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Well, it makes a certain kind of sense in a certain kind of context, but when you're trying to channel, you don't just let anything come through. Also, the other thing that I will get into eventually in one of these episodes is nobody creates a proper spiritual space anymore. This is absolutely paramount when it comes to spiritual practice of any kind. Look at any of the old traditions, the old spiritual traditions. They're constantly marking out spiritual spaces and constantly banishing and smudging, and there's incense and there's fire and there's water for purification. They're purifying the person before you even go into the temple. You might have to wash your mouth out and wash your hands and wash your feet and douse this fresh spring water onto your head and your clothes. Like, nobody does that kind of stuff anymore, especially in a modern new age spirituality context, when it's just like open up to Bashar. And more often than not, I find people getting led astray and going a cuckoo because they're opening to channel and they have absolutely no idea what they're doing. So again, just because you're experiencing something transcendent doesn't mean you're experiencing something spiritual. Just because you're able to talk with some kind of weird, disembodied extraterrestrial intelligence does not mean that that is connected to God in any way. Also, if you're not putting up the proper energetic or spiritual foundations for your own personal place of power and your own personal spiritual space, it's not good, So these are just some of the things that I want to talk about as this podcast goes forward. Kind of just like laid it all out there as far as it comes to spiritual experience. Again, just because you're experiencing something doesn't mean it's good. However, as a sort of gauge, if you're experiencing nothing, try something else. And just because you are experiencing something doesn't mean that it's spiritual in nature. And you should always be careful. Always approach these things with caution, especially when it comes to working with entities and spirits and whatever. All right. I'm Sadhaka. I hope you enjoyed it.